And one of the reasons I love to teach it is I really am enthusiastic about the material. I think that you will be too. There's a lot of really interesting and exciting points covered in the class, and I'm not going to say that you're going to be excited about everything we talk about, but I'm hoping that at least some things are going to jump out at you and say, gee, that's something I can use in the future, that's something I'll take with me, it's really interesting. So this YouTube that we just showed, Black Eyed Peas, is really very much about what we'll be talking about in this class, in the sense that we're going to be looking at the relationships between people, their environments, behavior, their well-being. And also it's a little bit about having some fun, and I think we're going to have some fun in this class. You know, college doesn't have to be unfun necessarily. So environmental psychology is basically the relationships between people and their everyday social and physical environments, and how those environments affect our behavior and our health and well-being. And you know, for centuries, architects and designers have known that the buildings they construct have a profound influence on occupants in those buildings. And historians of architecture and anthropologists also know that in every land, in every country, the environments that people construct convey cultural values, cultural meanings. But it was only around the 1960s and early 70s that the study of environmental psychology got going in earnest. And there were a number of reasons for this. One was that during the 60s, people around the world and in this country were becoming extremely aware of resource depletion. There was the book Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, that was published. There was the Population Bomb book by Paul Ehrlich that talked about overcrowding of the world. And we had urban riots in our cities, racial tensions. We had a lot of things going on that sensitized us to the broader environment. Now, those of you who are in PSB know that psychologists have talked about environment and behavior for a very long time, but when they've talked about environment, they usually mean very discrete stimuli that affect very particular behaviors. So whether a particular behavior is reinforced or conditioned by a particular sound, a particular noise, particular food stimulus. Well, what we're talking about in environmental psychology is the broader environment, like this classroom. This classroom is what's known as a behavior setting, and we'll learn more about that, but it's a system. You know, it's all of you, it's the physical surroundings, it's the height of the ceilings, it's the lighting, and it's the program, the behavioral program that constitutes this class every Tuesday and Thursday. So we're talking about units of the environment, whether they be high schools, offices, dormitories, apartments that you share with your roommates. Those are the kinds of environments we're talking about here. And it turns out that they do have a very profound influence on how we're feeling about things and our behavior. Now, environmental psychology is closely related to the school in which many of you are taking your majors, social ecology. And you know, when you graduate from social ecology and have your major, future employer is going to ask you, what the heck is social ecology? You know, why did you come out of a social ecology school? And we're going to learn about some of those basic principles of ecology, particularly next week, which gives a grounding for the rest of the course. What do we mean by social ecology? Well, environmental psychology is an example of a field within social ecology. So whether you're in criminology or planning or psychology, our school has an ecological perspective, which is to say that we look at phenomena, whether it's behavior, crime, planning, within a broad context. We're looking at these phenomena as being nested in layers of environmental influences, from the microenvironment to the more macro and the global environment. So we're interested in environment behavior at different levels of analysis. And we tend to study things not just in laboratory settings, but also in field, naturalistic field settings. So that's something that came out of ecological science and biology, where the biologists went out into the field like Darwin and started making observations, not in an experimental way, but in a very naturalistic way. So there's the ecological perspective. There's also the interdisciplinary aspect of our school, and the fact that environmental psychology, like every other field in our school, reflects a convergence of several different fields and disciplines. So in environmental psychology, we'll talk about architecture, we'll talk about natural resource management and geography, we'll talk about environmental cognition, we'll talk about public policy. So it's a very multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field. A third aspect of social ecology is that it has a clear community problems orientation. We're not just doing research for the sake of research and theorizing for the sake of theorizing, But ultimately, we want to see that stuff applied to try to improve the world in some way. And by the same token, when we go out into the field and we try to improve the world, we learn things that then feed back and improve our theories, our understanding. So it's a kind of cyclical relationship between theory, research, and application, what's today called translation to public policy or medical practice or what have you. So those are three aspects of social ecology that are shared by virtually all the departments and fields in our school, from criminology to planning to psychology, environmental science. The ecological perspective, the interdisciplinary feature, and the application to planning, the sort of reciprocal relationship between research and community problem solving. Now, the fourth aspect of environmental psychology is a little different than other fields within our school, and that is to say, we're going to put a little more emphasis on psychological processes that mediate between the environment and how you respond to it or how you work back on the environment. So we're going to be talking about things like how people interpret the environment, how they think about the environment, their cognition. We're going to be talking about personality as a psychological process, how the environment shapes your personality, and also the personality of places. You can go into environments in different places and they have a different feel, a different ambience to them. So you can even talk about the personality of places. We're going to be talking about how people learn about the environment, how they conserve natural resources. How do you get people to behave in a more green, ecologically responsible way? So those are all psychological processes of learning, cognition, perception, personality that we'll be covering in this class. If you're a criminologist or an urban planner, typically you're looking more at the macro level of environment behavior. You're not focusing so much on individual and small group psychological processes. So we'll put a little more emphasis on that here, but it'll be clear that environmental psych, like other areas of our field, do reflect those first three principles of ecology that I mentioned to you. Now, my assumption as you take this course is it's going to be one of the most challenging courses you're going to take, in that we're covering a lot of material. There's a fair amount of reading, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But I think it's going to be one of the most interesting courses you take because of its interdisciplinary character, and also because you're going to see relationships between your everyday life, like when you're talking to your roommate about who can have a friend over when, and how do you manage who puts up what on the walls, and privacy regulation and things like that. You'll see that some of the things we talk about in this class apply directly to your everyday lives. So I think that makes it pretty interesting. I think it's an important course in the sense that there will be a lot of take-home messages in terms of how these principles, these tools of environment and behavior, can be applied across many different fields that you might go into after you leave UCI. So those are some assumptions about the class, and I hope you will find it interesting and valuable as you take the class. Now we're going to show some PowerPoints just to get oriented to the course. And first off, I want to recognize our A-team of teaching assistants. Up at the podium here is Mark Combs, and he's a PhD student in planning, policy, and design. We've got Chit Van Trivedi, who is a PhD candidate in the social ecology PhD program. We've got Hiroshi Ishikawa, who's a first-year PPD PhD student. And we've got Beth Carlin, who is she has a master's, and also before coming to UCI, as do Chit Van, and I don't know if any of you, yeah, Hiroshi has a master's. So these folks have been around before they came to UCI in higher learning. But Beth is in the social ecology PhD program, and she is studying, among other things, pro-environmental behavior and translational media. So each of our TAs are going to have a chance to tell you more about their interests as the course goes on. I think you're going to really enjoy working with them, and I think we have a fabulous team of TAs. So as for me, like I said, I came to UCI back in 1973. Straight out of grad school. I didn't really expect to stay here too long because the campus was so new and undeveloped, and social ecology, frankly, a lot of my advisors thought that it was sort of a flaky sounding topic. Why would you go to a social ecology program rather than a psychology department? So I had to really wrestle with that when I decided to come here. And one of the things that really excited me about the campus was that there was a lot of opportunity to build from the ground up. It was an extremely new campus. There was the chance to do interdisciplinary things without being pigeonholed within a particular discipline. So I came thinking I'd stay a few years, and that's some decades ago. But my PhD is in social psychology with minors in city planning, sociology, and research in public health. So this was a really good place for me to be able to come to. I grew up in Miami, Florida, went to college at the University of Chicago, grad school at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then came out to UCI. Now, in this slide, I really want to encourage you to make our website your friend, because there's a lot of great information on the website. You can find out more about your TAs, their background. You can find out a lot about environmental psychology resources under the links page. But also, in terms of your day-to-day work in the course, there's going to be study guides for each week that you can download. There's 4 take-home assignments that constitute 10% of your grade, and those can be downloaded from the website. You've got the course schedule. You've got the syllabus that you can download from the website, and emphasize that email address up there. So right up here, we're going to be covering this email. It's a Gmail account, and we're going to be covering it on a daily basis. So if you want timely response, and we're going to try to get back to you the same day or within a day, send the email query to that address, okay? Because if you send it to each of us individually, we get a lot of email. We tend to get kind of stacked up with it. It takes a little bit longer to respond, but we're definitely going to stay on top of that. So if you have questions, the other thing is we offer some extra credit opportunities in the class to do a poster presentation or some kind of a YouTube video or blog. And so what we would like you to do is to send your idea for an extra credit project, if you want to do one, to that email address, and then we'll get back to you with an approval, or if we have any questions about it, whether or not to go forward. There are some examples of extra credit projects there. There's a little bit about the history of our school. This is what the reader looked like a few years ago, where students were paying $100-something for a reader. And we realized that we had to kind of get out of the business of these printed texts that students had to pay a lot of money for. So we've got all of the readings, the required readings and many of the optional readings, loaded into a web files folder. You can go there and get all the readings for free. So that's that little link there, link the course readings. And then after each lecture, I'll upload the slides, the PowerPoint slides. So typically I upload them after class, because sometimes we vary them and we change them around a little bit during class. So these links are really important. Also, Mark, Hiroshi, Beth, and Chitvan have posted office hours, as do I. So you can reach us face-to-face during those times as well. So definitely get to know the website and use it, because you're going to get a lot of good information. And stay on top of the syllabus and the course schedule, because that'll keep you current with the readings and what's due each week. And this is what the web files folder of readings is going to look like when you get into it. You can see they're all there alphabetically. And you just go to that link there. If any of you have trouble with that, send us an email to the class email. I believe you have to have a web files account at UCI, but it's a very easy thing to register. Just go to webfiles.uci.edu and you can register. These are the texts for the class. They're paperback books. They're on sale at the bookstore, but we will also put copies on Library Reserve if you want to just check them out from Reserve. I also have a set of copies, multiple copies, in the Planning, Policy, and Design Department office, so you can go in there and check them out as well. And as a matter of fact, the reader that I showed you is also in that office if you ever need to check on that. Now, what is this class about? So I told you a little bit about some of the course themes and how it relates to social ecology. One of the things the course is about is what we'd call hard architecture. And some of you might look around in this classroom and say, well, this is sort of hard architecture because the seats are bolted. I can't really swivel my seat. I can't adjust the height of the seat. Everything is sort of prefixed. But if you compare this room to some classrooms that I taught in back in the 70s and 80s, this is sort of an improved version, because you've got different kinds of lighting and you've got comfortable seats, not these really hard things. But hard architecture is architecture that resists human imprint. And you can think of, or any kind of human influence. You can think of a prison environment, or you can think of some kind of a low-income poverty environment where you don't have a lot of wherewithal to change the environment. It just changes you and it impinges on you, but you can't work back and modify it. And that's what Robert Summer means by hard architecture. And if you look over here in his book, he shows our engineering tower building. And what that's about is he came out to UCI during the late 70s and he did a lecture here, but he also did sort of a photo inventory of the campus and published this book and said the UCI campus is like San Quentin prison because it's so hard, it's so uninviting to people, it's just monstrous concrete structures. And in fact, in his preface, this is what he says about the Irvine campus. He says, the obvious conclusion is that San Quentin, Pruitt-Igoe, we'll talk about the Pruitt-Igoe buildings in St. Louis, and the Irvine campus of the University of California should never have been constructed in the first place. The scale, the scope, the impermeability of the architecture is oppressive to the human spirit. Build a university 20 miles from a city, arrange the offices and classrooms so that people can never meet, put the money into parking lots instead of lounges, develop an incentive system around individual achievement rather than common effort, and the result will be an alienating campus. Now, in the 1970s, the campus was not as built out. We didn't have a student center. We had these ring of, these hard architecture buildings around Aldrich Park, but there wasn't much beyond that. So partly in response to this criticism, the campus planners here at Irvine got to work and they started really augmenting the architectural offerings on the campus with some improved buildings. And they took a look at the classrooms, and there was a committee of the Academic Senate that went to work on developing guidelines for improving learning environments. So, these kind of critiques can make a difference, but that's what we mean by hard architecture. And I think as you go through the course, you'll see examples of architecture which isn't so oppressive, architecture which actually invites you in or which, makes you feel better. But the broad scale environment can have a huge influence on how we feel about ourselves, how we behave. So Aldrich Park was sort of the pivot point for the whole campus from the beginning on. And when Chancellor Aldrich and Ray Watson, the first president of the Irvine Company, who, by the way, got his degree in urban and regional planning, his master's at Berkeley, and he came out of some courses there that talked about environmental psychology and some of the work by Kevin Lynch on urban imageability. And he and Chancellor Aldrich designed the campus in that circular pattern so there would be a focal point with a nice natural environment in the middle. So that's been here from the very beginning. Yeah. I think before fields like environmental psychology got going, people took buildings for granted. A lot of architects decided it was their whim and their prerogative to design whatever looked cool, and it didn't have to fit people's needs, but as long as it was aesthetically striking, it would be great. And in fact, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis, which was later demolished because people wouldn't live there, won all kinds of architectural awards before it was built. And it was only after people moved in and the structure of it was so alienating and so oppressive that people couldn't live there. So I think before the 60s and 70s, before this field, there wasn't a lot of sensitivity about human needs in large-scale environments. And there's another organization called the Environmental Design Research Organization, which started in 1970. They had their first conference, and they've been going yearly ever since. And it's a combination of multidisciplinary people that get together and they present research on environment and behavior issues from a geographical perspective to an architectural, sociological, et cetera. Here what we've got are some of these classroom environments that are a little bit rigid. And nowadays it's this sea of computers. If I go back in the room and sort of take a look at all the screens from Facebook to NBA playoffs to this, that, and the other, we're not in the playoffs yet, but it's a little daunting, We like to think of ourselves up here as sort of imparting information and being the focus of attention, but it's very humbling when you go back and look at all the screens. But now here's a small lecture class, a graduate class, where you have people sitting around the table, and there's not as much of that sort of computer emphasis, and it's a little bit more interactive face-to-face. But we're going to be in this type of classroom here, and I want to say a couple of things about sort of civility and principles in the classroom. My view of things is that we're in a kind of digital era, and I'm not one to sort of police computer use. I mean, I think all of you are adults. You have a choice to make. If you come to class, if you want to text and chat and, you know, do Facebook in class, it's your choice. I'm not going to police that. The only thing I would say is if you're being disruptive, like you put something up on the screen and some of you are huddled and you're laughing about it and you're disrupting other students, then we'll call you out on that, because it's really important that you respect your fellow students and you respect whoever's giving the lecture, you know, to be polite. But I hope that you'll pay attention to the lecture, because I think you'll get a lot out of it. And I also understand some of you take notes during the lecture, so you're using the computer to sort of go along with what we're talking about here. But you know, some classes say turn them off, you know, close them up. We're not going to do that. I mean, when I go to conferences, I use my computer, I check my email, so I'm not going to be, you know, sort of holier than thou and say you can't do that. But the main thing is not to be disruptive of each other. That's the key thing, just to be respectful when you're in the class. There are principles of community and honesty at one of the web links up on the homepage, and definitely review those. They're UCI standard policies. One thing I want to say about these rooms in environmental psychology, if I go over here and where's the light switch? Oh yeah, why don't you dim them? Yeah. So one of the things we know in environmental psychology is that lighting in a class, in a situation like this, we're all huddled together and you're elbow to elbow with other students. When we turn the lighting down, you become less self-consciously aware. And so often environments, whether you go into a restaurant or some other place, a lounge, they turn the lights down lower so that people don't feel as self-conscious. Okay, so you can turn it back up. So, you know, when you've got the glare of all those lights, it's a little bit more, you feel more conscious about it. We also know that if you look at the height of this ceiling, you know, there's one thing, you know, if you look at a room and say, well, it has X number of square footage, but there's also cubic footage to our environments. And we know that as you increase cubic footage, not just square footage, cubic footage, the sense of crowding goes down. The lower the ceilings, the more the sense of crowding. And just as if you compress people in smaller square footage, more sense of crowding. So, you know, we're going to look at some of those kinds of phenomena in this class because they're all around us. We don't usually think about them, but I think this class will sort of change how you see the world as you assimilate some of this information, because you'll see examples of this when you walk around the campus, when you go home, when you're in a healthcare setting, what have you. How is that environment affecting you directly, and how do you work back and change the environment? Another theme of the class is functional versus dysfunctional environments. These are some examples of some dysfunctional environments, or those that obstruct rather than support the activities and needs of their occupants. And we call that low person-environment fit. An environment where you fit, or that's congruent with you, there's a kind of a harmony between what you need, what you want, and what the environment dishes out. And if you're a child going to school under the flight path of the Los Angeles airport, you're hearing 350 overflights a day at 90 to 120 decibels. That's a lot of noise. And that does affect the children's blood pressure. It affects their academic performance, because we've actually done studies to test that. Here you've got the Pruitt-Igoe buildings in St. Louis, the ones that won those architectural awards. And they later had to be totally demolished about 16 years after they're constructed, because half of them were empty. People would just refuse to live there. There was so much vandalism, so much crime. And yet those buildings were praised as an innovative solution to low-income housing in St. Louis. So what that did is it wasted a huge amount of resources. There was a lot of money that was put into building these structures, and then they had all be torn down. So one of the things we're talking about in environmental psychology is how do you avoid those design mistakes, and how do you avoid creating dysfunctional environments? How can we take the information from the research that we cover in this class and apply it to improving those environments so we don't make as many bad environments and mistakes? We're also going to talk about something called environmental justice. And it so happens that that school under the flight path is in a low-income racial minority neighborhood in Los Angeles. And there is this phenomenon of environmental justice or injustice, environmental racism, which has been found in many different cities. And what that is that the worst land uses and the most contaminated parts of cities typically are reserved for the most vulnerable populations, because they don't have the economic or political wherewithal to turn that around so those undesirable land uses get foisted on their neighborhoods. So we're going to talk more about how that's an example of environmental injustice and what can be done through public policy to try to turn that trend around. Urban stress. How many of you are familiar with the term stress? Yeah, you probably use it on a daily basis. I certainly use it during my week. And this is an example of how environments can cause us stress. We can be stressed with our partner, we can be stressed with a friend, or we get a bad grade. But in environmental psychology, we're going to be talking a lot about urban environmental stressors like noise, crowding, pollution, and how those affect our physiology, how they affect our well-being. Whether you're sitting on the 405 freeway here in rush hour, or you're in a very crowded environment like Times Square in New York, or you're dealing with the pollution in large urban areas, and whether we have grown up in a large city in the US or Mexico City or Beijing or wherever, we're grappling with very tremendous pollution challenges today. So we'll be talking about stress. What makes us stressed? How do we avoid stress? We're going to talk about environmental cognition and behavior. In this example, you see the Seattle Space Needle. And according to one theory of environmental imageability, or how people form clear images of their urban surroundings, they use these kind of landmarks, and they use the path system. So when you first came to Irvine to go to school here, you probably had to figure out, how do I get around Irvine, whether I have a car or I don't have a car? What's the street structure or the street system? What are the key landmarks? If I'm walking around campus and I want to get to the Bren Center, maybe I look for that anteater statue outside the Bren Center. Or if you go by our Social Ecology 1 building, you'll see a kind of funny, colorful sculpture, which gives you a landmark. And people use these landmarks to form images of their cities and to find their way around cities. So that is something we call urban wayfinding and environmental cognition. Here what you've got is dressing up this trash can to not just be more visible because you put a bird on it and people notice it. There's also a kind of social prompt here, be a little bit thoughtful. And when you put these kind of decorated trash cans in shopping malls and you compare how much trash people put in these cans versus in non-decorated cans, your standard non-decorated trash receptacle, these draw significantly more pounds of trash. So people see the trash can, they're intrigued by it, they put the trash in the trash can. So again, it's an aspect of our environment we wouldn't think to look at or think about, but it's having that influence on us nonetheless. Planned communities and new towns. My kids grew up in Irvine. They talk about growing up in the bubble, this planned community. But what is it about planned communities? Are they really ideal? Are they good places to live because they're green, they're healthful, safe? Or do people kind of get tired of them because they're kind of uniform, they're not diverse enough? I'd rather live in Westwood or Laguna Beach than in Irvine, that kind of thing. And people have different preferences about environments depending on where they grew up, their personalities. I'm going to show you a little, Mark's going to run a YouTube clip here on what it's like to be in Irvine. Okay. Sorry if that offended anybody, but that's one take on what it's like to live in a planned community. But clearly, places have these personalities or these feels to them, and people can feel like they belong in a place like Irvine, or they can feel like misfit and not that they're congruent with a place like that. So what is it about our environments that acquire these meanings, these symbols? One of the things Irvine does have is it's got a lot of green space, a lot of parks, or what urban planners sometimes call green belts. And we know from research that we'll be studying in this class that just as environments can stress us out, environments can also reduce stress. And one of the things we know is that exposure to wilderness, exposure to nature is a very effective way of lowering our stress level. Some people refer to these as restorative environments because they allow us to go into a setting where we're not focusing so much on a directed task like having to take notes in a class or study for an exam, but we let our mind wander and follow a pack of birds going through the sky, or hear a waterfall or whatever. And so, we can distinguish between what might be called voluntary focused attention and involuntary or spontaneous attention. And natural environments give us opportunities for this kind of involuntary, spontaneous attention. So nature there's a lot of research showing that it has this restorative power. And this is actually a tree in Irvine that I took a picture of on a particularly beautiful sunset. This is Harmony Lake in British Columbia. So no matter where that natural setting is, even if it's some landscaping near your apartment or your home, it can have a very profound effect on our well-being. And we'll talk about some low-income communities where comparisons have been made between housing areas that have sufficient foliage and landscaping, those that don't, and how the children are affected by those environments. When I talk about using these principles to change our environments, and one of you mentioned that there have been changes in our buildings as we learn more about environmental psychology, these are some examples of how that principle of restoration, restorative environments, are being incorporated into work environments. So you've got this Google office here where the employees can go into a meditation room and sort of look at aquaria. The lights are very low and they relax, and it's a kind of break from the stress-filled day. This is another office in Madrid where they've built the environment, they built the office right into a kind of forest setting where all the views are of nature. This one here in Slovenia, the same kind of idea. And then this is a workplace meditation area designed by a fabric designer named Talia Draheim in Northern California. And some companies now are including these kind of breakout environments where you can go and you can take a break from your regular workday. One of the articles assigned for today is about the effects of looking out the window of a hospital as a surgery patient, and how that view of what you see, whether it's a park or the wall of another building, a hospital building, how that affects your request for pain medication, how it affects your speed to recovery, to checking out of the hospital, how you get along with the nursing staff. And this was a very influential study published in the journal Science by Ulrich, which found that for gallbladder patients, and there were about 200 patients in this study, more than 200 patients, who were assigned to hospital rooms that had a view of nature or a view of another building. He measured after day one of surgery, what was their request for pain medication. And you can see that as time goes by, in the tree group, the people looking out the window at the trees, they're requesting more weak doses of pain medication, whereas the people in the wall group are requesting more strong doses of medication. And you see that trend throughout. And this is kind of what the experimental environment looked like, where you had the hospital rooms, some viewing nature and some viewing a brick wall. So this is part of our ambient environment. We say ambient because it's outside of our usual awareness. It's, you're a patient in a hospital, you're thinking about your illness or your injury, not the environment outside. And yet these views, these view amenities, we would call them, looking out the window, do play a role in your recovery. They become part of the therapeutic environment, which is kind of interesting. Before this study, nobody quite realized that. How many of you have rooms that look, well, let's say this one, which is more decorated. How many of you have that? Now, some of you may have the more sparsely decorated rooms. This impulse that people have to sometimes personalize their environments. If you look around this room, this classroom, you don't see any personalization in terms of where you are, is this the School of Social Sciences, who has classes in here. But if you go into some offices or some bedrooms, there's very little use of that space to convey who's there. People sometimes put up posters of their favorite bands, or they put up their political party affiliations and things like that. And a study at the University of Utah found that for freshman students, those that didn't decorate their room in the first semester of freshman year tended to drop out of college at a much more significant rate at the end of the first year than students that went ahead in the first couple of weeks and decorated their rooms. So there's something about sort of making your imprint on that environment and kind of bonding with it so that it reflects your identity, where the students who have rooms like this tend to stay in that university longer. They also have pictures that reflect the campus environment rather than just pictures that reflect their pining away for some environment that's far away that they miss. So it's a very interesting example of what we call environmental personalization. And if you think about your rooms and your environments, you can think about, what's your style in terms of whether you put up a lot of stuff about yourself, or whether you tend, not to be so explicit, in terms of what you put up. But a lot of companies have trouble with this because if they have environments that are like a blank slate, like the walls of this room, the employees go into a conference room to have a meeting, but there's nothing that tells them, that reinforces their group identity, their team identity. So, one of the things that we see in these slides here, and this is a meal area for an office of the UCI Medical Center, where there's really nothing on the wall. It's kind of a drab situation. And here you've got a environmental planning firm in Irvine where they used to have a situation like this, but they put a lot of investment into sort of dressing up their environment inside the office and putting up, posters of their projects, putting some green plants in here, using some different colors to make it a more interesting, inviting space. Here again, you've got a conference room that tells the workers nothing about where they're working or what their team identity is, whereas here, in this same environmental planning firm, they've put a lot of attention to putting up pictures of the employees on the wall, showing the awards that the company has won. So when you go into their conference room, you get that reinforcement of who's there and what they're about. So that's what we mean by environmental semiotics, which is a fancy word for environmental symbolism. How do we use the environment to communicate something about our individual or our group identity? So these are some examples of how companies do that. This is Pacific Care in Cypress, California, where they put a vision and a value statement on the wall in the lobby. So you walk in there and they telling you what their vision and values are. And it's always an issue of, well, are they living up to that empowerment stuff and all the good values? But nonetheless, they're putting it out there to be evaluated on the basis of whether their employees feel they're living up to that. Here you've got what I just showed you, the example of sort of celebrating the collective team achievements. Here in Pixar, this is a recreational area in Pixar where they've put up some symbols of some of the movies they've developed. So when people come in there, they pick up the identity of Pixar, that they're known for Toy Story, or they're known for, whatever films have been smash hits. And this is another example of where they are conveying some shared values and identity by making this a very playful work environment. It's almost like a kids' play area where you go into this Pixar team work environment. So there's some computers there, but there are all these other kind of things that make it an interesting place. So that's one of the ways that companies are trying to take these principles and make the environments more interesting and inviting to their employees so that the employees stay, they don't have as much employee turnover, they don't have as much employee stress, they give them meditation rooms, and they also give them some economic things that are good in terms of stock sharing and good meals and things like that. But back before the 60s and 70s and before you had any interest in environmental psychology, companies didn't really care that much about their environment. It was seen as a cost center. If I put money into the outside shell of my building, or I paint the colors, paint the walls different inside the building, or I give people an interesting meal area, it was seen as a way of using up company revenue rather than as a strategic investment in productivity or in team morale. So we've got a different era now. Even though we're in a recession, we have some very forward-looking companies, whether it's Pixar or it's Google or it's even Facebook's environment, their corporate environment, where they give the employees a lot of messages about who they are as a team. One of the terms you'll hear about this quarter is called sociofugal versus sociopital environment. Think of centrifugal and centripetal force in physics. Centrifugal force is where you have a satellite going around the Earth and it's trying to get away from the Earth's gravity. It's trying to break away. So a sociofugal environment is pushing people away. It's like a library environment where they don't want you to talk too much, so they put you in these carrels with rigid walls. And some would say that this classroom is a little bit of a sociofugal environment because you're all facing one direction. You can't turn around easily and have a conversation, although we're going to change that later in the course, and you'll see how that works. But sociofugal then, like centrifugal, means sort of pushing people apart. So you've got this elderly care facility where the seats are back to back, the people can't talk to each other. It's a kind of an alienating situation. Or in this airport here, where you've got this guy sitting here, but you've got hard seats that are pointed opposite each other. It's not conducive to social interaction. Here in Ghirardelli Square, San Francisco, you've got more of a sociopital situation. And you were saying like a circular pattern brings people together more. So the satellite is being pulled in by the Earth's gravity. And by the same token, people are being pulled together, drawn together by that environment. You can think of a lounge in your dormitory, which might be a sociopital environment. You can think of this public space where people tend to socialize and mingle. And we're going to see examples of how companies sort of balance those different types of environments. And not just companies, but healthcare settings and a lot of other types of environments. I'm just giving you some examples from work environments today. So here you've got some sociopital environments. You've got this sort of couch space here at Pixar. I'm picking on Pixar today because they have a lot of good visual examples. They've got a ping pong table, billiards set up near their meal area, so employees can go over there and recreate, get away from sort of their work routines. Here at Facebook, they give you a kind of sound system. You can play music, queue up music here. You can play basketball and other sports out there. And this is Google Zurich, where they've got, you know, kind of a recreational area as well. So what these environments do is they bring the employees together. And one of the things that Steve Jobs insisted on when he was helping to design the Pixar headquarters. How many of you have read the biography of Steve Jobs? Okay, it's a really interesting book for those of you who are interested in and use Apple products, where all that stuff came from. But Steve Jobs insisted on creating a centripetal or sociopital environment at Pixar where the restrooms were located in the middle of the building, the meal areas where people went to get their food was located in the middle of the building, these kinds of recreational spaces where people could sort of engage in sort of downtime activities, all of that was in the middle of the Pixar headquarters in Emeryville. And so what he was trying to do there is get people to bump into each other and interact. And that's what we mean by a sociopital environment. And as you go through your day-to-day routines, you'll see some environments that are pretty alienating or push people apart, keep them apart, and you'll see others that tend to bring people together. We mentioned music, and one of the reasons we're going to do a lot of music in this class is it's a great example of how people express their relationships to places and environments through lyrics. Also, different types of music make us feel different in terms of, you know, whether we have a fast tempo and we're listening to a rap tune, or we're listening to classical music, or we're listening to classical rock. All of those, you may have very different preferences for those, but they tend to invoke different kind of feelings, different kinds of states. Some of you have heard some of these Playing for Change videos, and we'll play some of them later. But I'd like you to think about kind of songs in your life and sort of how they reflect these connections between you and your environment, or between the lyricist, the composer, and their environment. You can think of so many examples. In the Beatles, for example, John Lennon rode around his hometown and composed the song about places. There are places in my life, and the song's called In My Life. And it's really a reflection on his connection to that environment where he grew up. And it's expressing those emotional connections through that song. There's a lot of examples like that, so we'll talk about those as we go through. Environmental planning. How many of you are urban studies or planning enthusiasts in this class, majors? Okay. If you look around how the city of Irvine is laid out and planned, one of the things you'll see is the number of fast food restaurants per capita in Irvine. And we're going to talk about the obesity crisis, especially in the next lecture, but there's a couple of articles today assigned, if you should pick up on those. But one of the things that influences intake of fast food, which tends to be higher fat content, a little bit more prone toward obesity, is access to and proximity to fast food restaurants. And we know that in many low-income communities in the US, they have so many fast food restaurants. There are no Trader Joe's, there's no Whole Foods and that kind of thing. You get those in more affluent communities, and some people point to this as a kind of environmental injustice, but they don't have as much access to good food, so there's a lot more consumption of, you know, In-N-Out burgers and things like that. I mean, I'm not, you know, panning In-N-Out burgers, and my kids, you know, always wanted to go through here and get an In-N-Out burger when they were growing up. But the fact that we have so much opportunity to do that, whether it's Del Taco or it's other fast food in the area, it's even more predominant and prevalent in low-income communities. Now, it's not just the physical environment that affects our health, and there's a big interest now in combining urban planning with public health. You know, how we plan our communities, access to good food, fast food, how that affects health outcomes. But it's also the social environment. And we're going to read, today there's some web links I'd like you to look at on the syllabus, where they've studied the social contagion of obesity. And what this means is that if you look at this social network over 25 years, and they've done time-lapse research on the networking relationships, what happens is that heavier people tend to gravitate toward or hang out with heavier people. If your friend gets heavier, you tend to get heavier. Now that's, you know, you wouldn't think that's the case, but there's this kind of contagion of obesity that they've found. And that's controlling for, you know, time and people's weights before and after over a period of time. The more yellow these circles, or the people located in those nodes within a network, the heavier they are in terms of their body mass. And where you see these green clusters of dots, those are people who are leaner, not as heavy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and there's a link that you can go to on the syllabus or the homepage where you can actually see this time lapse play out with their data. This is a quick kind of overview of how the ecological paradigm, I talked about social ecology, which has evolved here at UCI, but it started in biology, bioecology, which was the study of the relations between organisms and their environments. So that's what we mean by ecology, study of organisms and their environment relations. The Chicago School of Human Ecology in the 1920s took the biological principles of, you know, bioecology and plant and animal biomes and how they reach equilibrium in natural systems, and they applied it to human communities, and they called this human ecology. Study of the relations between people and their urban ecosystems with an emphasis on biological and economic processes of adaptation and the spatial distribution of health and behavior problems. And to give you an example of their research, and we'll talk more about this next week, they developed what they called a concentric zone model of Chicago, where they found this pattern of higher crime rates and deviance and health disorders in the middle of Chicago, in the Loop area near Lake Michigan. And as they went out to the more affluent suburban areas, those rates of disorder dropped off. And so this came to be known as the concentric zone model of urban disorder, based on the Chicago School of Human Ecology. That was a pretty simplistic interpretation, and we know that a lot of communities, if you try to plot behavioral disorder and disease in Los Angeles, it doesn't work that way because you have a multi-node city where you have several different sort of urban centers within the LA basin. So not all cities are like Chicago where you have this monolithic, huge downtown area. But even so, in that city, you know, these relationships, this was kind of preliminary insight back in the 20s, but what has happened since then is that we've had a broadening of the ecological paradigm applied to people, applied to humans, as the study of the relations between people and their environments from a broad interdisciplinary perspective, where we're giving greater attention to social, psychological, institutional, cultural contexts of people-environment relations than earlier human ecology research did. So now we're talking not just about economic drivers of those spatial patterns of disorder, but we're talking about how people's symbolism and their attachment to environments sort of sometimes trump economic incentives and motives and account for how people react to their environments or protect their environments even more so than economic theory. So you have places in the Boston area like Beacon Hill where in the 1920s and 30s there were a lot of proposals to come in and build high-rise apartment buildings and retail shopping centers, and the people in that neighborhood would have benefited by all the jobs and all the income flowing in, and yet they resisted that and felt that that would diminish the historical and symbolic value of their neighborhood. So they decided to resist that, and this led to a famous paper by Walter Fiery on sentiment and symbolism as ecological variables. So it was not just about economic and biological processes, but also cultural, symbolic processes. So this is a kind of quick overview of some of the different schools of ecology and what we mean by social ecology at UCI as it's developed here as a much broader multidisciplinary field than what it started out with in biology and later in Chicago in sociology. Social ecology is a pretty going concern around the world. There's a lot of new social ecology programs sprouting up in Europe, Australia, and so Irvine was quite a sort of a precursor here, but it's really been a movement that's spread more widely. This fairly involved slide, what this is saying is that our local environments and what goes on in our local environments are very connected to what's going on globally. So we see a lot of change and trends in the global sphere in terms of the prevalence and predominance of the internet, which is connecting people all over the world. We see certain violence and international and ethnic tensions that are continuing around the world. We haven't figured out a way to get rid of genocide and violence and terrorism. So there's all of that socio-political conflict. And then there's also the geophysical changes, you know, planetary warming and ozone depletion. So those global sources of change in our environments are affecting a lot of changes in our local environments. So when you sit in a classroom now, you know, you've got to be wired. There are these virtual links between local and global environments. We have hybrid environments now. Our home is not just a refuge anymore from work, but now it's a base of multitasking. We do online banking, we download movies, we do our work from home, we do our domestic stuff at home. So home has become a multifunctional, polyfunctional or hybrid environment. It's not just home, it's not just family, it's work and family now, and recreation. So what these changes in our local environments are doing is that they're creating certain psychological effects on us. There's a lot more distraction and information overload. Many of you get scores of emails, text messages, cell calls every day, much more than we had to process maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago. Continuous partial attention, the fact that people are always scanning the environment. You know, you're working on a paper on your computer, but then you're checking email and you're checking Facebook and you're checking Google+. And there's this tendency for us to want to be in touch with just about everything, to take in as much information as we can. But what this means is that we can't focus as well on sort of dedicated tasks. And we have less time maybe for meditation or less time for that sense of focus. So we're becoming a little bit more fragmented in our behavioral routines. When you're working in an office now, you might be interrupted 13, 14 times a day because of different self-calls you get or emails or faxes. And actually there's a professor in information computer sciences here at UCI, Gloria Mark, who has studied knowledge workers' interruption rates and how fragmented their behavior has become because of all of these virtual interruptions. We talk about the state of absent presence, changing notions of friendship. You know, I can be on a cell phone call and whoever I'm talking to is absent. They might be, you know, my son's in China, he might be calling me on Skype, and he's not here physically present. He's absent, but he's psychologically present. And by the same token, if I'm doing that in the middle of my lecture, I'm going to be less present to you, more absent to you, because I'm engaged in that virtual conversation. So there are these little conflicts that are creeping up between our place-based environments and our virtual environments. And you've got employees at work surfing the net, and their bosses get mad, or their coworkers get mad because they're not focusing on the job. You know, they're recreational surfing. Or sometimes in classrooms, a situation will come up where, you know, using the internet for non-class reasons creates certain discrepancies. So that's what we mean by absent presence. You know, somebody may be virtually present, but they're absent physically, and we may be absent psychologically in a particular environment, even though we're standing very close to somebody in that same place. You know, there are feelings of powerlessness that we're having now because we're exposed to so much immediate media coverage of tsunamis and tornadoes and violence in the Middle East and other places, and it's very hard to ignore that. It's affecting our stress levels. It's, you know, we're so interconnected now. I just want to read you a passage, a quote by Deepak Chopra, who's the spirituality and wellness author. And he said that we are living in a very interesting time. What is emerging is that you cannot separate yourself emotionally or in any other way from what is happening anywhere in the world. We are a global community. We need to feel this pain. We need to act upon it. We need to realize that we are now entangled with everything that happens everywhere. And he speculates that, if people saw those bombs going off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, and people saw the devastation at that time, real time, just as we can witness the Indian Ocean tsunami or the Japanese earthquake and tsunami or some other scary event, traumatic and disastrous event, we see that in real time. It has a huge effect on our psyche. So that's what we're meaning here, that the global changes that are going on in our world really have immediate local consequences and effects on us. And we call these synergistic changes between these different global trends because they reinforce each other. So people are becoming more aware of these global trends because they have the internet. They can get all of that data through video, through YouTube, through everything else at our disposal. And we're seeing the widening disparities between different socioeconomic, racial, religious, and ethnic groups. And in this country, there's a lot of talk now about income inequality. So all of this increased salience or awareness because of the internet and because of our immediate contact with the information has this effect on us. We're more sensitized to the consequences of global problems. We wonder how individuals perceive and experience and react to these global threats. What toll does that take on our health? How do we identify and mobilize psychological and situational circumstances to move from just feeling powerless and anxious to some kind of collaborative, constructive action? So these are some of the questions that come up when we are witnessing on a daily basis really powerful traumatic events globally. And here you can see how in our own environment, the effects of global warming are starting to change what kind of automobiles Detroit car makers are turning out. We've got battery cars, we've got hybrids, we've got cars that are responding to these needs in terms of global warming and carbon use. This is the president of GM at the time where they were about to go bankrupt and they had to be bailed out. That guy was pretty stressed. Fortunately, things have turned around in Detroit quite a bit, but these global events have tremendous impact on us. The fact that our cars weren't selling relative to Japanese cars or other car makers, how is this, our car makers, how are they going to be more competitive? What do they need to do to change their products? On our local campus, you see how the global environment affects our local interactions. We have this olive tree initiative here at UCI, which takes the Middle East crisis and the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, and it brings Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu students and students of other religions together for collaborative discussions. And they also take trips to the Middle East where they visit Israel, they visit Palestine, and there are opportunities for more getting to know each other on a face-to-face basis. So some of these global events are actually affecting what goes on the campus in terms of how we deal with these issues here. Now, I mentioned the effects of the internet on our psyche and how that's become a study in environmental psychology, a focus of our study. These are data for 2010 where there were about 1.6 billion internet users in the world, and now there are over 2 billion internet users and over 5 billion cell phone users. And there's almost 1 billion cell phone users just in China alone. The virtuality of our lives has changed dramatically. It's really pervasive now. Some would argue that this is a good thing. Negroponte wrote a book, Being Digital. He said that living digitally will include less and less dependence on being in a specific place at a specific time, and the transmission of place itself will start to become possible. So we don't have to come to a university to get educated. We can go online and take a distance education course and get the same value. It's more democratic. You don't have to get into UC or Harvard or some other place. And we'll talk about, well, what are some of the trade-offs between digital and place-based education? But nonetheless, there's some real fans of virtuality saying it makes us more efficient. We'll talk about third places as a nexus or bridge between first and second places. A first place is your home or family environment. A second place is your work environment. Third places are things like coffee shops, Pete's Coffee, or a bookstore or a bar, where people go to kind of let down their hair and interact informally with strangers sometimes, as well as with friends. Oldenburg, who came up with this theory of third places, claims that for cities that don't have third places, they're not very interesting places to be because people don't have that variety between home and work. They don't have enough third places. And you can look at the city of Irvine and say, do we have enough third places in Irvine where students can go or people of different preferences and backgrounds can go? And that's an interesting question. We have a very planned community, but do we have enough diverse third places? We also have hybrid places, which is to say that our first places now are morphing into hybrids of work, home, family, recreation. Even our workplaces now, employees are demanding meditation environments, good food. They want childcare settings, daycare settings for their kids. So it's not just going to a work headquarters, it's a work-family kind of or domestic environment. So that's what we mean by hybrid places, where you're getting these combinations of second and third places, first and second, et cetera. You've got the offices at home that are wired, or you've got the Starbucks where everybody's on their computer. Rather than interacting with each other socially, they're all sort of isolated, working on their own laptops. What's happened with our communication is that we've gone from local synchronous, which means face-to-face communication, to more asynchronous remote, where we're leaving messages for each other through email, voicemail. And when you look at local asynchronous, that is something that happens at different times. You can leave a note on a colleague's desk if they're not in their office. Or here you've got synchronous remote, where you have a video conference, but people are located remotely in different places. But generally, there's been this trend from face-to-face local, real-time interaction to more of this asynchronous remote. So that's a trend that we're going to look at a lot in this class. We talked about continuous partial attention. People are monitoring Twitter feeds, they're monitoring email, they're getting cell phone calls, faxes. There's a lot of tendency to engage in continuous partial attention. You know, trying to pay continuous attention to everything around us so that we don't miss anything. Always on, anywhere, anytime, any place. And this is leading to behavioral fragmentation. We mentioned multitasking, distraction, you know, texting while driving. You all know some of the examples of what that can lead to. And one last slide here I want to leave you with. It's not just the virtual environment that distracts us and causes this continual partial attention, but here you've got an apartment building in New York City built over an expressway, and there have been studies of the kids living on the lower and the upper floors of this building, and they find a lot of learning problems among the kids that live on the lower floors that have the higher noise levels from the freeway. They don't do as well in school. They can't decipher between different words that sound alike. So this is a kind of source of dysfunction as well in our daily environment. It's not just the virtual intrusions, but also the place-based distractions that we have. All right, have a good evening, and we'll see you on Thursday.